You are listening to the Foreign Policy Focus podcast.
We cannot wait for the final proof. The smoking gun. It could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Haven't you driven enough people from their homes already? Bulldoze their villages, seize their property and their laws. They had no part in making it.
Now working in Libya with friends and allies, we've demonstrated what collective action can achieve in the 21st century.
Now the host of the show, Kyle Inslee.
This is episode 293 of the Foreign Policy Focus podcast. I want to say a very happy 2019 to my listeners and a huge thank you for all the support that you gave the show in 2018. Unbelievable success last year. Looking back on, the patrons that I've added for the show and all the downloads that have surpassed all my, kind of expectations for what I was hoping to get from the show in 2018. It's really great. So thank you everyone who's contributed to the show or shared the show or recommended it to a friend. And I really hope you all continue to do that because, I got some new projects I'm working on. So hopefully I'll have some big announcements in 2019 here. One's likely coming pretty soon. And then, I'm working on a few things that I hope will materialize throughout the year and I'll be able to kind of let you know. But very exciting, looking forward as to what's going to happen as we start to look at, presidential candidates giving speeches and, we'll be able to analyze and break all that down and really talk about, these issues, I think a little bit more tied in with the mainstream, in the off election years, or the midterm years, you really don't have, I think, as much debate and attention paid towards foreign policy. You get a little bit more during the presidential debates just because when you're talking about the president, I think you have to talk about the war because the president's commander in chief. So we'll have some more opportunities to talk about the war kind of based on the, what's going on in the mainstream. So very exciting outlook for the show. And I hope you continue to enjoy it. On today's show, I have a ton of news to break down. So much going on in the world. And I'm trying to get out these year-end review shows with Will that I'm doing. The second one covering all of Trump's terrible stuff will be coming out probably within the next week. Also coming up on episode 300 of the show. So I'll be recording that soon. But I want to try to get to and cover a lot of the important stories going on around the world today. So share the show, foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com, libertarianinstitute.org. Donate to the show, patreon.com/foreignpolicyfocus. And of course, give me a rating and review wherever you could find a place to do that. All right, we'll start off here with the Pentagon. The spokeswoman, Dana White, has resigned. She did this on New Year's Eve. I only point this out because I've talked about Dana White a couple times in the past on the show and just how excellent of a spokeswoman she is. I mean, she goes out there and she really presents in almost a robotically perfect, smile on her face way about all the terrible things the U.S. is doing and puts, the absolute spin on it, the way, to sell it best. So, it seems to be a positive thing to me. I usually don't care, who the spokesperson of the Pentagon is, but in this case, maybe the next person will be a little bit more of a fool and give away a little bit more, than Dana White, I think did. Also, worth it just to keep a tab on her with her being so well spoken. Who knows what other, career ambitions that this woman has, but it could be very dangerous. We have this NBC reporter, longtime, I think, correspondent, William Arkin, who resigned from the network and then sent out an email explaining his resignation. This is probably a name that you've heard of. I don't know if you would call him like kind of the mainstream establishment type of reporter, but he, works for the big networks. He's a pretty well-read guy, seems to generally get the war stuff right eventually. And just seems to be somebody with a little bit more journalistic integrity than like a Rachel Maddow or Chris Hayes. So he resigns, from the network, saying that basically in his email that the network has lost it. They're complete reactionaries to Donald Trump and, points out the war issue as well, saying that, the network just shills for endless war. So it's good to see, first of all, this happening. More people need to take a moral stand, and, this probably goes beyond the war issue. When it comes to their jobs and to say hell no when they're given, bad orders or see bad things going on around them or seeing themselves being part of a corrupt and dangerous system. I think these resignations, especially by people who command some respect, like William Arkin, and, who have a name that people recognize, unlike myself at the dinner table. And so when you say, oh, William Arkin did this, people might, take a look and notice a little bit. So I think this is one of the stories that we could talk about. I'll link to Caitlin Johnstone's piece on the issue. Pretty good breakdown. She takes some pretty good excerpts from Arkin's email explaining his resignation, and then, adds in some stuff about, MSNBC's kind of coverage of issues like Russia and Syria troop withdrawal. Glenn Greenwald had a good write-up in The Intercept, and I'll also link to this in the show notes page. What Glenn Greenwald explains in this article is that after 5 weeks here, we had this accusation, or this article really, where in the article The Guardian claimed that Paul Manafort met with Julian Assange 3 times, and this was, kind of proof of ties between Trump and WikiLeaks during, the campaign. Now, the problem here is that, pretty quickly, skeptics of this story pointed out, well, you don't have any real proof. You have unnamed sources saying that this happened, but you don't have any video of a heavily surveilled area of Britain, heavily surveilled city. You don't have even his name in a sign-in book, which certainly wouldn't be conclusive proof, but would be something. Or, anybody willing to go on record by name and saying that, yeah, Paul Manafort was there. Paul Manafort and Julian Assange denied this reporting. And so I think you have to have, some kind of proof, innocent until proven guilty kind of look at the thing until you could prove that this meeting happened, assume that it didn't. So the problem really is here is that 5 weeks later, you've had a story that's been corrected a few times to really soften the language. And I think this is an important part here. So essentially what you had happen when the story dropped was The Guardian has definitively stated it, and as a matter of the record now, Paul Manafort and therefore the Trump campaign had ties with Julian Assange. However, later versions of the story really make it sound a little bit more like, oh, this maybe happened. There's accusations that this happened, but there's, not that real proof that happened. However, because the original story, and, we got this very kind of, I think, short attention span on these issues and like the 24-hour media cycle that we always talk about, drive-by media, as Rush Limbaugh would say. Basically, the first conclusion is all anybody really remember, that Paul Manafort met with Julian Assange, and you don't have any of this other very important corrections really gets into people's understanding of what happened or what is alleged to have happened. So anyways, Greenwald, points out that essentially The Guardian's gone quiet. The authors aren't responding to anybody for comment. The editor-in-chief of The Guardian or any, I guess, other staff who would represent the content that they produce in their paper have come forward and say like, hey, this is now the paper's standing on this article. We're issuing more corrections or a retraction on the article or anything like that. Or answering the critics and saying that, oh, this is the reason why there's no video evidence. Or, we've now talked to these 3 people who are willing to kind of give their names and say that, yeah, we saw Paul Manafort meet with Julian Assange on these dates. And then, the most important thing to remember here is that this is representative entirely of the whole Russiagate conspiracy, is that you have these, media organizations, all these newspapers making these huge claims. And then it turns out that their unnamed sources must not have been correct. They never, come out and name their sources and say, oh, I got conned by this person. They never had the actual proof that they needed. And yet, we still get people saying that Trump colluded with Russia, and we absolutely know this to be the case when there's still no proof of it at all. All right, so I want to talk about this arrest here of Paul Whelan. I guess is how you pronounce his name. Sorry, everyone, if I mispronounce things. I never watch the TV news coverage, and so if things are pronounced differently than they look like they should be pronounced, I don't know what they are. If it bothers you, you could send me an email, and I'll try to get things right. This guy, though, is a U.S. citizen. He's traveling in Russia and is arrested a few days ago now, and, on accusations of being a spy. From my understanding, there hasn't been a whole lot of a public explanation by Russia or, what seems like communications from Russia to the United States on this issue. I will say that the U.S. response has been a little bit more moderated than the typical Trump administration response. There's not a whole lot of bluster. It seems to be a little bit more calibrated and measured. Here you had a story come out saying that, they expect the Trump administration is going to demand from Russia the immediate release of this U.S. citizen. And what actually happened is Pompeo just asked for an explanation for the arrest. We do now know that Paul Whelan has been granted access by, or at least Russia claims that they have given him access to basically an American representative. I'm guessing U.S. ambassador or U.S. diplomat of some kind in Russia. Other than that, I don't think a lot is actually known at this point as far as, what he is alleged of spying for. I assume that it must be state spying, but who knows? I mean, it could be like a corporate espionage kind of thing. And, he's being accused of trying to steal some kind of Russian technology or, something like that. There's, I guess, a lot of things that could still be revealed here. So, unlike the mainstream media, I'm not going to jump to any conclusions here. I think one thing that they're jumping on is saying that this is a retaliation for the arrest and detention and plea agreement, I guess, of Maria Butina. I discussed her story on a past episode of the show, and I'll link to that in the show notes page. But essentially, what's happened is you now have a Russian woman who I guess was kind of lobbying U.S. senators without our U.S. People, probably politicians, without, registering as a foreign agent. So not really a spy as initially claimed, or espionage, or, sleeping with Americans for influence, but rather just a woman who was paid on behalf of a Russian official to lobby for gun rights in the United States, which isn't quite as big of a deal as espionage, I suppose. But they're saying that it's in retaliation for this. However, there's been a lot of events that have unfolded in this past 5 months that if Russia was doing this just out of retaliation, and it turns out that Paul, who is a former Marine in this line, is really being played up in the media. They really don't refer to him as his name. They just say a former Marine. That, his arrest there's a lot of other things that his arrest could be in retaliation for, or could turn out that, I guess, he's actually a spy. It seems unlikely to me at this point, but we just have to wait for more facts and details to emerge over time on this one. Kim Jong-un gave his New Year's address. This, I think, is a big deal as far as it goes for, North Korea kind of vocalizing its policy. My guess is that it's probably one of, if not Kim Jong-un's biggest speech of the year, as far as, it goes, of importance in the North Korean culture. Two, I think, kind of important takeaways from the speech are, the first is that he says he's ready for a second meeting with Donald Trump. I think this is the most important thing that could happen. I don't have a good feeling that John Bolton and Mike Pompeo, Mass is gone now, and all the other, different, kind of establishment deep state clowns are giving Trump, the best case for Korean peace. And I think, people like Kim Jong-un and, Moon Jae-in, the president of South Korea, give Donald Trump a much better, kind of view of what Korean peace means and what it will take to achieve that. And so if Donald Trump could sit down with Kim Jong-un, I think more progress could be made. Now, I don't think that Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un sit down and the next day Kim Jong-un agrees to give up all of his nukes. But, they could maybe hammer out a concrete step here. Or Kim Jong-un, at the very least, could explain, why it's so important for the North Korean side to have sanctions relief before denuclearization. That does seem to be the big sticking point now, is that's the other thing that Kim Jong-un pointed out in his speech, that essentially North Korea is going to start to look at other pathways that they can't get any sanctions relief from the United States. Now, I think all the Hawks are instantly interpreting this as North Korea is making threats. Other avenues could be other things. I do agree, though, that, this is possibly a threat. That they'll start, not attack the United States, but they'll start, doing things like ramping up their missile program or nuclear program. And so, at this point, I think talks between Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un would be really important. I think the United States needs to start to give sanctions relief to the Kim regime. You also have a situation here that maybe Kim could explain to Donald Trump in person. Certainly probably can't put this out in a statement to the Korean people that, look, hey, Donald Trump, just like you, I have Hawks in my country. And, those Hawks are going to be on me if I'm not, building nukes and missiles and all this kind of stuff and looking to defend the Korean people from their, big bad American enemy. And so, to show that we could get along with the U.S., you have to give us some victories. You have to provide some sanctions relief. My people need to eat a little bit more, feel a little bit more food in their belly, and then they're going to say, oh, I'm doing the right thing. I think this is one of the very unfortunate things about Trump's exit from the Iranian is that, you had a situation in Iran where they elected a more moderate candidate. He makes a deal with the United States, and then the United States bats out on the deal. What kind of message does that send to the Iranian people? What kind of credibility do you think that gives the Iranian hawks? In the Philippines, we had an Islamic State affiliate group attack, suicide bomb attack, killed 2 people. Always tragic when these things happen. I mainly just kind of brought up this story because I saw it build pretty much everywhere that was covered as an ISIS attack in the Philippines. I think it's important to remember that when we see these alleged attacks in other countries by the Islamic State in places like the Philippines, that there is an insurgency to the government. We saw them take over a town, and I think like 1,500 people end up dying in the assault to get it back. You had U.S. military involvement, a very messy situation. It's Marawi is the name of the town. And, this it may not be international jihad, but homegrown Philippine terrorist. And, it's kind of a different thing, especially as we're looking at the U.S. withdrawal here in Syria. One of the points that the Hawks are going to bring up is, ISIS could use this as an area to launch attacks. And no, it's, probably more of a reaction to the oppressive government in the Philippines. I mean, what's his name? Duterte there is absolutely, seems insane to me. He's talking about molesting his maid. He, has this vicious drug war and does all kinds of terrible things. So no surprise there if, the suicide bombing is more a reaction to the Duterte government than to, the United States not bombing ISIS enough times in Syria. In Afghanistan, insider attack. This happens in the territory near the Iranian border, I guess. You have some Afghan forces start shooting at NATO allied forces. I guess, since they are labeled as NATO forces, I'm assuming that means they're probably not U.S. troops. The insider attack was not successful. 1 Afghan soldier died, and my assumption is the way the story was written that Afghan soldier was not one of the insider attackers, and that one of the attackers was killed and then the other one was injured. This is a huge problem, though, for the American and NATO war effort in Afghanistan. These attacks on our forces by, kind of the Afghan army is essentially how it comes off, where you end up with programs like the Guardian Angels who, are snipers that sit there during these training exercises and make sure that none of the Afghani soldiers are Taliban insiders and, start shooting at American, soldiers in Afghanistan. And so you have all kinds of crazy things where the American army is pointing guns at the Afghan army that they're training. More violence around Afghanistan as the Taliban attacked Afghan army positions. In northern Afghanistan, I think they took a couple outposts from the Afghan army and killed was about 27 Afghan security forces. In southern Afghanistan, they blew up a Afghan army outpost. The Afghan army says 5 died. I think the Taliban claimed that they killed 35. So I'm guessing the truth on this one is somewhere in the middle. But, this is just representative. And as I talk about on the show every week, 2 or 3, 4 stories that, 20 Afghan soldiers died here, 10 died here. They lost this outpost. They lost this police headquarters. They lose this district. It's just, more and more Taliban gain. There's an article in the New York Times. I'm going to link to this one in the show notes page, just because I think going through and reading it, and the details it gives about the stories are very important and, kind of humanize the situation in Afghanistan. But you essentially have these rogue Afghan security forces that are sponsored by the CIA and therefore above the law in southern Afghanistan, just been rolling around in southern Afghanistan, killing people now, committing war crimes, executing innocent people for absolutely no reason, and then, just burning down the houses to cover up the evidence. These, as the story points out, there's several times where the people they killed, everybody in the community says that there's absolutely no way that they're members of the Taliban. Sometimes they're kind of connected members of the community to the Afghan kind of army occupying forces there. At other times, there are people within distance of the Afghan army outpost. And so they know that, these people aren't terrorists or anything, or Taliban members or anything like that. Yet they kill them anyways, and then they just claim they were Taliban. They burn the bodies, and that's that. And so you could, read it in the New York Times because they go through and they give a lot more details kind of about the individual crimes that happen here and really do good reporting on, exposing the truth of what's going on here in southern Afghanistan, where you have kind of CIA trained and sponsored forces, I think 3,000 to 10,000 of them, just going around and committing war crimes. I think the other issue here that they point out in the article, but really don't emphasize, is that, these Afghan forces go around speaking English. And so it's just further reinforcement, that the American occupiers are the problem. There's going to be talks later this month in Saudi Arabia between the United States and the Taliban. Hopefully this turns out good. The Taliban did refuse to talk to the Afghan government at this meeting. The Afghan government, I guess, is going to send representative. The Taliban throughout the war have refused to talk to the Afghan government, calling it illegitimate. I'm not sure if it's more of fear of that they give the government legitimacy by negotiating with it, or realize that anything that's not agreed to by the Americans really isn't an agreement that matters at all. They could kind of whatever deal what they want with the Afghan government. It's a soft puppet government of the United States. I think I've seen numbers that say like half of the Afghan government's funding comes from the United States, which basically means, if we threaten to withdraw the funding or do anything, the Afghan government adds on the U.S. command like puppets on a string. So the Afghan government doesn't have a lot of real autonomy, so why negotiate with it? Either way, or if it's a little bit of both, I think we're going to continue to see the Taliban refuses to negotiate with the Afghan government unless the United States first, I think, makes an agreement to really draw down or completely withdraw from Afghanistan. So Iran put out a statement saying that they're going to allow these private companies in, I guess they're Iranian private companies, continue to facilitate Iranian oil exports. I guess this is kind of the way they're getting around the U.S. sanctions right now. Now, of course, the United States gave sanctions waivers to countries, including one of those countries being Iraq, to continue to buy some products from Iran. However, for the most part, the U.S. says, you can't buy things from Iran, but the U.S. still sanctions different Iranian, I guess, government companies and the Iranian government itself. And so you can't actually buy oil from the Iranian government. So there's using kind of these proxy companies to facilitate these oil deals. The Iraqi government, I guess, is not too hot with the U.S. right now, and I'll explain why in a second. And they're saying that, they don't have to obey the U.S. sanctions against them. And so you have this situation where the United States spent the past 17 years creating the Iraqi state and establishing the Iraqi government. And the first thing the Iraqis are saying, now here is that, now we're not going to listen. We're going to do what we want. It's, more 16 years for Iraq. But, they're just not going to listen, and, they're not going to obey the U.S. sanctions. I guess I should get into the reason here, just to make the whole story make sense, of the reason why the Iraqis aren't too happy with the Americans right now, and it has to do with Donald Trump's visit to the U.S. soldiers on Christmas. This happened, I think it was supposed to be more of a surprise visit, but the Iraqis demanded that the U.S. land at an Iraqi airport and meet with the prime minister and do all the formal things that I guess leaders are supposed to do when they visit countries. Donald Trump either didn't do this, didn't understand the importance, or for whatever reason chose to land at a U.S. airbase and then not meet with any Iraqi officials while he was there. I think this was seen as a slap to the face to the Iraqis, and now they're saying that they want to have a debate in their parliament about forcing U.S. troops to leave the country. And wouldn't that be something, right? If you have a situation here where we're in 2019 now, 16 years later, and the government of Iraq that the United States has built up, funded with millions of dollars, we built up their army, and they say, get the hell out of our country, and we're not going to listen to your sanctions about our neighbor state, Iran. You have kind of an interesting situation here between the Iraqi government and the Syrian government. Now, it seems like with U.S. forces and the U.S., kind of military being so tied in with the Iraqi military wouldn't do anything to help the Assad government. But with the authorization, the Assad government, the Iraqi government, carried out some attacks against the Islamic State in Syria. The Syrian government says they can only do this with the permission of the Syrian government. I don't know how much permission the Syrian government has given to Iraq to carry out these cross-border attacks into southern Syria to attack ISIS forces. There's been probably a few dozen airstrikes at this point carried out by Iraq into Syria. But, it kind of does seem representative of the fact that you now have governments in Iraq, Syria, and Iran that are all going to kind of be generally aligned with each other. And this really odd thing where the U.S. military has essentially built the Iraqi government, Iraqi military. And so, what's going to happen to the U.S. influence in Iraq as we move forward here, especially with our very hostile position to their two neighboring governments and two friendly neighboring governments. All right, so here's the big thing going on in Syria right now, of course, is what the hell is Donald Trump doing? And then the answer is that nobody is sure, I think, including Donald Trump, on how long it's going to take U.S. forces to leave Syria. I will say I was probably a little overly optimistic that we're going to get this 30-day withdrawal, and it now looks like that's not going to happen. We have CNN reporting, and this is an unnamed Pentagon source, saying that the Pentagon talked Donald Trump into a 4-month, 120-day withdrawal from Syria. And basically the Pentagon said that this is the quickest we could do it, keeping U.S. troops safe and logistically withdrawing. This seems like an awfully big stretch to me that it's going to take 4 months to do so. I could, and as I pointed out on an earlier show, that it's probably going to take a few days here to kind of locate all the equipment that you need to take out of the country, make sure all the weapons you're getting and you're moving out. There's also the issue here that the United States is giving the Syrian Kurds tons of weapons, literally tons of weapons, and we're supposed to be getting those back at the end of all this. That's what we said all along. That's what we told our NATO allies, the Turks. We say, don't worry. Once the Syrian Kurds are done using these weapons against the Islamic State, we'll take them back from them. And you don't have to worry about them being used against you. Now, we have some U.S. commanders in Syria advocating that the Kurds retain those weapons. And my guess is that, they're saying that they need these weapons to defend themselves from the Turks, which is, the exact reason why originally the U.S. said they were going to take the weapons back from the Kurds, is because, they didn't want them to be used against Turkey. The really complicating thing here now is that it seems the U.S. establishment, at least, is in really a pretzel, right? It has our NATO allies, the Turks, and it has our supposed enemies, the worst human in the world, Bashar al-Assad in Syria, aligned with the other worst humans in the world, Vladimir Putin and the Ayatollah in Iran. And you have these other people, the Syrian Kurds. And if the U.S. withdraws, the Syrian Kurds, who the U.S. is back and has really romanticized, I think, in our media as to, who the Kurds are, as this, kind of Western culture in the middle of very dark and repressive Middle Eastern democracy. And the safest thing for the Kurds is going to be for the evil Russian Assad Iranians to kind of fill, the United States void and reclaim that territory and say that, this is now once again part of the sovereign state of Syria, and the, sovereign state of Turkey has no right to attack us. Where if Assad doesn't fill the gap, then Turkey is possibly going to attack, saying that they need a buffer zone and, take 10, 15 or so kilometers of Kurdish territory into Syria. And as we saw in Afrin, the troops that Turkey used at times were, kind of these Al-Qaeda forces that they hired to, be mercenaries. And they went and committed war crimes against Syrian Kurds, specifically the female fighters. And so you really wonder what's going to happen. I think this is why the establishment is so wed to the position of U.S. troops have to remain in Syria, is, that this is kind of the only way they don't have to deal with this pretzel that they've created for themselves, is just by keeping the status quo. Now, the problem is that the status quo is going to change, and that either the Syrian government or the Turks are going to eventually attack the Syrian Kurds, whether Americans there or not. And, you know, when that happens, then all these factors come back into play. And so it seems that at this point, clearly the safest and the best move for the United States is to leave, to do so in an organized fashion, of course. Make sure we get all of our, you know, guns and trucks and everything else that we leave there. Don't leave them around for other people to pick up and use against other people. Make sure we take them with us, but we get the hell out of town. And, you know, if there's a way to withdraw in a way, you know, that allows the Assad government to peacefully retake territory, then that seems to probably be the way to lead to the less violence. But, you know, the U.S. has no mandate to do that. We just need to get out. So who knows how long we're going to be in Syria or if we ever get out. I'm a little less optimistic than I was a couple days ago about it, but I'm still optimistic that Donald Trump really does want to leave Syria and is going to push for it. And hopefully, you know, maybe the good news here is that the pushback from the Pentagon right now will push Donald Trump to pit somebody to be Secretary of Defense who does want to get out of Syria. And so, you know, that may make it more likely to happen. Other notes on Syria is just, I have no idea what the status of Manbij is. Apparently there's, you know, Syrian government flags flying into the city. There's Syrian troops there. I believe there are still U.S. forces there. I've read several times that the Kurds have left. But then, you know, if you read, you know, the Kurds withdrew in December and then you read they withdrew in January, then how did that happen? And so I'm not quite sure if all the Kurdish forces are gone. I know that, you know, there are Turkish troops that have massed on the kind of border of that city. I haven't read that, you know, they're, you know, kind of withdrawing now and realizing that, you know, the Kurds aren't going to control long term and there's no reason for their invasion or no way for them to invade. But I'm not confident that, you know, the case is that, you know, the Kurds have withdrawn. The Turks are now backing off their threats to invade that city. So hopefully, you know, in the coming weeks, I'll actually be able to explain to you who's actually in control of Manbij right now. But what, you know, just a crazy situation that you don't know who controls the city, that it seems like you have U.S. forces there and at odds with our NATO allies on the other side of the border. And then again, you know, you have the Syrian forces in the city, and it seems that the U.S. is able to get along with those guys, and they're going to make a deal for those guys to retake the city eventually, or at least the Syrian Kurds will. You also had some fighting between what are kind of the Idlib forces in Syria, and those are the more Al-Qaeda forces, and then I think like kind of the Turkish-backed Euphrates Shield forces. Now, Turkey really, I think, bats and controls Syrian rebel forces all over, and probably even some of the jihadist forces within kind of the Idlib and northern Aleppo territorial areas of Syria. But this fighting probably isn't a great thing here. You know, just more death and destruction in Syria. We have the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights estimating that 20,000 people died in Syria in 2018, including 6,500 civilians. Now, terrible, terrible. But good news is that this is the lowest numbers of the war. I do understand the problems with the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, who that organization is, you know, that they're backed by the UK government. However, there's not a lot of other people who are doing this kind of work right now in Syria. And so, you know, these are probably kind of the best guesses that we have right now, are that 20,000 people died in Syria in 2018. We also have numbers for Iraq in 2018. This is from Margaret Griffiths. And unlike the kind of Syrian Observatory for Human Rights estimate in Syria, which is kind of guessing, you know, I think based on all their data, how many people died in Syria in 2018. This, I think, is a body count number, and it's 7,200. And I believe this is the lowest since the U.S. invasion of Iraq. So again, this is a great thing. I mean, 7,000 people died. Terrible, terrible, terrible. All probably unnecessarily so. However, good news is that, you know, the numbers are decreasing. And so maybe you have, you know, a little bit of peace and stability returning to this region. Now, the huge problem is that you have all these countries that are ravaged by war, you know, looking at Syria and Iraq right now, who, at least Syria, is probably going to face lasting sanctions from the United States, really going to hurt their economy, really going to hurt the rebuilding process for the country, going to make it a lot harder for aid and construction projects to get done. You know, transnational agreements and all this other stuff will be severely limited by the sanctions. And then if Iraq, you know, goes along and buys oil from the Iranians and kicks the U.S. troops out of their country, well, they're probably going to face U.S. sanctions. And, you know, what's that going to do to, you know, cities like Mosul and all these other Sunni cities in Iraq that, you now have a situation where the government's being sanctioned. These are the minority people. Their cities are destroyed because the Islamic State was there. And so, it could be really harmful to the Sunni population of Iraq. All right, last thing here, and I know I'm going long, but I've been doing a lot of other kind of shows, so I do want to touch on what's going on in Yemen right now. As far as the Hodeidah ceasefire goes, it seems to me more or less, as I look at, kind of the maps and reporting out of Yemen, the violence in the city has slowed. There doesn't seem to be an active ground operation to retake the city. The Houthi forces, and I believe this was reported by the UN coalition, have withdrawn kind of from the port areas of the city of Hodeidah, and had turned control of the ports over to the Yemeni Coast Guard. Now, I would have assumed that the Yemeni Coast Guard was manned by kind of Yemeni government and Saudi forces. However, apparently one of, the Yemeni Coast Guard generals last week was, a Houthi general. And so the Yemeni Coast Guard is, members of the Houthis. And so the, kind of Yemeni government that's recognized and backed by Saudi Arabia and the United States is saying that the Houthis aren't living up to their end of the agreement here. Now, what the truth is here, I really don't think is, able to determine at this point. The problem is that the UN World Food Program, which gives a lot of food aid to the people of Yemen, is now threatening to cut off aid to Houthi-held territories, as what they allege is kind of corruption on the Houthi side, stealing food and prioritizing, I think, food to soldiers and all these other kind of things that isn't supposed to be going on. Now, the Houthis point out that this also goes on in the Saudi, U.S. Yemeni government-backed areas of Yemen, but, the World Food Program isn't complaining there. Moon of Alabama blog points out that you have this case where the Saudis and the Emiratis donated $500 million to the UN World Food Program, and so maybe they're yielding the influence from their donations, to kind of help, kind of wage a food war against the Yemeni people. Now, I will say, I'm sure that at least on a small scale, there's different kinds of corruption going on among the Houthi food distribution. I mean, more or less, the Houthis are kind of the governing force right now in a large portion of Yemen. And just like any government, they're going to engage in corruption. That should come as no surprise whatsoever. That corruption may be worse just because, the Houthis are supposed to be kind of a militia force, and I don't think that necessarily, going to be a political force that came in, have any idea how to run like food distribution or anything like that. And so it may be a case too where it's not all intentional, it's just kind of poor management. We also have some reporting. I'll link to this article in the show notes page, so those of you who want to read it can. And I believe this also came from the New York Times, that Saudi Arabia is recruiting a lot of child soldiers to fight in Yemen. And some of these child soldiers are from, I believe, Sudan. Now, I think all sides in Yemen are probably recruiting kids under the age of 18 to engage in fighting. And basically, they're just offering money. There's no other jobs in Yemen. So, any male who could pass for a fighting age male is probably going and grabbing their gun. And as, tough as fighting has been there and as important as, things are right now for both sides to hold the lines that they've, kind of drawn in Yemen, fighters are extremely important. So, the recruiters probably aren't too picky with how old a boy looks, so long as, he could hold a rifle and shoot. They're probably willing to, just pay him a salary to go do that. All right, so talked about a lot of terrible things on today's show, but, hopefully we'll end up with more good news as 2019 rolls on here. If you want to share the show, foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com, libertarianinstitute.org, Twitter at KYAAALE, patreon.com/foreignpolicyfocus, my news website, immersionnews.com. Really cool stuff there. Hopefully going to be doing a lot more with that in 2019. And then also check out minds.com, crypto social network site. I really like it, and I'm on there at Immersion News.